There are plenty of things a man can learn to forgive. Harsh words said in anger, a forgotten anniversary, a stupid argument that went too far. Even certain kinds of betrayal, I suppose, if both people are willing to look each other in the eye and admit what they did. But there are some things you can't explain away. Some moments show you exactly who a person is, and once you've seen that clearly, you can't force yourself to forget it. Believe me, I tried. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 42 years old, and after nearly 9 months stationed overseas, I came home expecting to walk through my own front door, kiss my wife, eat something that hadn't come out of a plastic container, and sleep in my own bed. Instead, 4 hours after my plane landed, I was sitting in the back seat of my father's old 2001 Buick LeSabre in a Target parking lot outside Amarillo, Texas, holding my mother while she cried against my chest. My duffel bags were piled beside me. My father sat behind the steering wheel without moving. And on the dashboard was a smoke-stained photograph of my younger sister, Rachel, who had been dead for 7 years. That was my homecoming. Not balloons. Not dinner. Not my wife waiting at the door. A parking lot. My parents living in a car. And a photograph that had somehow survived a fire when almost nothing else had. I've spent enough time overseas to know what exhaustion feels like. I worked 14-hour shifts in heat that made the air itself feel heavy. I've lived on bad coffee, broken sleep, and phone calls home that always seemed to disconnect right when somebody said something important. I've seen people receive terrible news. I've had days I still don't like thinking about, but I wasn't prepared for what I saw in that parking lot. My father, Harold Mercer, was 76 years old. He had spent more than 4 decades repairing engines, transmissions, brakes, and anything else with enough metal in it to break. His hands were permanently rough. His knuckles were thick and scarred, and there always seemed to be a little bit of grease under one fingernail, no matter how hard he scrubbed. Dad wasn't the kind of man who complained. If his back hurt, he stretched. If he was tired, he drank coffee. If something broke, he fixed it. If he couldn't fix it, which didn't happen often, he found somebody who could. My mother, Linda, was 71. She'd worked most of her adult life in the cafeteria of a public middle school. By the time she retired, she knew the names of half the families in her neighborhood and probably remembered more birthdays than the people whose birthdays they actually were. She was the woman who brought food when somebody got sick. She mailed handwritten cards. She remembered how everyone took their coffee. When my wife, Melissa, and I got married, Mom spent nearly 4 months making us a quilt by hand. Every square was different. She had stitched our initials into one corner. Melissa smiled when Mom gave it to us. "This is adorable," she said. Then she folded it, put it on the top shelf of a closet, and as far as I know, never touched it again. At the time, I didn't think much about that. You don't notice certain things until life gives you a reason to look backward. Then there was my sister, Rachel. Rachel was 26 when she died. She was coming home from an evening class in Wichita Falls when a man who had been drinking ran a red light and hit the driver's side of her car. She died before the ambulance reached the hospital. Rachel wanted to become a physical therapist. She was loud, stubborn, funny, and absolutely incapable of minding her own business when she believed somebody was being treated unfairly. She was the kind of person who would argue with a stranger in a grocery store because the stranger was rude to the cashier. She would have been 33 that year. My mother still kept Rachel's senior portrait above the fireplace. Every Christmas, Mom put one of Rachel's old ornaments on the tree first. She didn't make a ceremony out of it. She never announced it. She just did it. I carried a smaller copy of that same photograph whenever I deployed. It stayed tucked inside my wallet. I suppose everybody carries something that reminds them who they were before they left. For me, it was Rachel. And somehow, when my parents lost almost everything they owned, Rachel's photograph was one of the only things that survived. The fire started on a Monday night. My parents had lived in the same house in Amarillo for 37 years. It wasn't a fancy place. 3 bedrooms. 1 bathroom that Dad kept promising to remodel. A small kitchen. A garage full of tools. A backyard where Mom grew tomatoes, peppers, and enough zucchini every summer to supply half the state of Texas. That house held almost their entire marriage. Birthdays. Christmas mornings. Arguments. Apologies. Rachel and I doing homework at the kitchen table. Dad teaching me how to change brake pads in the driveway. Mom standing on the porch waiting for Rachel to come home from her first date. All of it gone in one night. An electrical fault started somewhere inside the wall behind the laundry room. Dad woke up because he smelled smoke. By the time he opened the bedroom door, the hallway was already filling. He didn't have time to think. He got Mom out of bed. They ran through the kitchen and out the back door. Dad didn't even have shoes on. Neither did Mom. They stood in the backyard in their night clothes and watched flames push through the roof of the house they'd spent nearly 4 decades building a life inside. The firefighters did what they could, but sometimes what they could isn't enough. The house was essentially destroyed. Furniture, clothes, Dad's tools, Mom's recipe books, boxes of photographs, Christmas decorations, Rachel's childhood things. Most of it was gone. But as Mom ran through the hallway, she reached for something. She didn't plan it. She told me later she didn't even remember doing it. Her hand simply reached toward the wall and grabbed Rachel's photograph. She ran outside, holding it against her chest. The glass cracked from the heat. The wooden frame was dark around the edges, but the photograph itself survived. When Mom told me that part, I had to look away. I still do when I think about it. My parents had some insurance, but nowhere near enough to immediately replace everything they'd lost. Dad had savings. He'd worked hard his entire life. But retirement savings are meant to stretch across years. They aren't designed to rebuild your entire existence overnight. My parents weren't helpless. That's important. They weren't looking for someone to rescue them forever. They needed somewhere safe to sleep. A few nights, maybe a week. Enough time to figure out what came next. And they believed they had somewhere to go. My house. The house where my wife was living while I was overseas. My parents called Melissa from the fire scene. She didn't answer. Dad tried again while they were sitting in the Buick. Nothing. Mom called once more. Still nothing. So they drove to my house. Because, as my father later said, I didn't know where else we were supposed to go. I want you to picture this. My 76-year-old father. My 71-year-old mother. Both of them smelling like smoke. Neither wearing proper shoes. Everything they'd owned a few hours earlier, either burning or soaked in water. And my mother standing in my front door, holding the damaged photograph of her dead daughter. Melissa finally opened the door. Mom tried to explain. She was embarrassed. That's the part that still makes me angry. My mother had just lost her home, and somehow she was worried about inconveniencing my wife. Melissa, honey, Mom said, there was a fire. The house is gone. Melissa stared at them. Mom continued, we don't need to stay long. Just a couple of days until we figure something out. My father said, even one night would help. One night. That's what he asked for. One night. My wife looked at 2 people who had just watched their home burn down and told them she wasn't comfortable having anyone stay in the house without notice. She said she needed privacy. She said the house wasn't prepared for guests. My house had 3 bedrooms. One of them was a guest room. In 5 years of marriage, nobody had ever slept in it. Melissa told them that having people in the house would interfere with her routine. Then she closed the door. My father didn't argue. That's who he is. He put his hand gently on my mother's back, walked her to the car, and drove away. They spent that night in a parking lot. Then another, and another. 11 nights. My parents slept in a Buick for 11 nights while my wife slept in our 3-bedroom house. And I knew none of it. I was thousands of miles away. When I finally landed at Rick Husband Amarillo International Airport, I was exhausted, but I was happy. That particular kind of happy you only understand when you've been gone too long. I wanted a shower. I wanted coffee that didn't taste like it had been filtered through an old boot. I wanted to sit somewhere without thinking about what time I needed to leave. Mostly, I wanted home. I called Melissa. She answered immediately. You're here. Just landed. I can't wait to see you. Everything sounded normal. That's what gets me. Completely normal. Then I call Mom. No answer. So I called Dad. He picked up after the 4th ring. Hey, son. 2 words. That was enough. I've known my father's voice my entire life. I know when he's tired. I know when he's angry. I know when he's pretending something doesn't hurt. There was something underneath his voice that day. Something controlled. Dad, what's wrong? I'm fine. Dad. Silence. Then he told me about the fire. He told me like he was explaining a problem with an engine. Short sentences. Facts. No emotion. The house caught fire. They got out. Nobody was hurt. Most things were gone. Insurance people were involved. They were working on it. I stood beside the baggage carousel listening. People moved around me. Families hugged. A little boy ran toward his grandfather. Somebody laughed. My duffel bag came around the carousel once, and I didn't pick it up. It went around again. Then I asked the question, "Where are you staying?" Dad didn't answer. "Dad, we're managing." "Where?" Another pause. I felt something cold move through my stomach. "Where are you sleeping?" "Son, don't worry about it. Tell me." He finally did. "In the car." I thought I'd misunderstood. "The car. We've been parking over by the Target most nights. Security hasn't bothered us." I looked around the airport. Everything suddenly seemed too bright. "Why aren't you at my house?" Silence. "Dad, your mother called Melissa." That was all he needed to say. I understood before he finished explaining. She said it wasn't a good time. I stood there completely still. I remember a woman walking past me carrying a pink suitcase. I remember an airport employee pushing an empty wheelchair. I remember the sound of the baggage carousel. Strange things stick in your memory when your life changes. "How long?" "What? How long have you been sleeping in the car?" Dad sighed. 11 days. 11. I closed my eyes. "Where are you right now?" "Same place." "Stay there." "Daniel." "Stay there, Dad." I grabbed my bag. I didn't call Melissa. I didn't go home. I rented a car and drove straight to that parking lot. I found a Buick near the far end. Dad was behind the wheel. Mom was asleep in the passenger seat. There were grocery bags on the floor. A blanket was folded in the back. Rachel's photograph sat on the dashboard. I parked beside them. For a few seconds, I couldn't get out. I just sat there staring. Then I opened the back door of the Buick and climbed inside. Dad looked at me in the mirror. He looked older than he had 9 months earlier. Much older. I put my hand on his shoulder. He reached up, covered my hand with his, and squeezed. Neither of us spoke. Then Mom woke up. She turned around. When she saw me, she covered her mouth. "Daniel." That was it. Then she started crying. My mother isn't somebody who cries easily. She has always been the person holding everyone else together. Seeing her break like that did something to me. I pulled her into the back seat as best I could and held her. And while I was sitting there, surrounded by everything my parents still owned, I had one thought. Melissa put them here. My wife looked at my parents and decided a parking lot was more acceptable than her inconvenience. I had been home less than 2 hours. I drove straight to my house. Melissa was sitting on the couch with her phone when I walked in. She smiled. Actually smiled. "You're home. I thought you were going to call me from the airport." I dropped my bag near the door. "Where are my parents sleeping tonight?" Her smile disappeared slightly. "What? My parents? Where are they sleeping?" She stood up. "Daniel, I can explain." "Good. Start with where they've been sleeping for the last 11 nights. She crossed her arms, and that small movement told me more than I wanted to know. She wasn't ashamed. She was preparing to defend herself. "Daniel, they just showed up. Their house burned down. I know that. They were wearing pajamas. I know. They had nowhere to go. That doesn't mean they can automatically move into our house." I stared at her. "Move in. That's how these things happen. Somebody says it's one night, then suddenly it's a week, then a month. I was here alone, Daniel. You were overseas. I didn't feel comfortable taking responsibility for 2 elderly people. Responsibility? Yes. They needed a bed. I need boundaries." I remember laughing once. Not because anything was funny. Sometimes your body doesn't know what else to do. Boundaries. Don't make it sound ridiculous. My parents slept in a car for 11 nights. I didn't make them do that. That sentence. I can still hear it. I didn't make them do that. "No," I said. "You just refused to open the door." She looked away. Then she said, "Daniel, I didn't start the fire." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She continued, "I'm not a caretaker. I never agreed to that. Your parents are adults. They've lived their lives. They have to handle their own problems." I felt something inside me become very calm. Not angry. Calm. Dangerously calm. Then she said it. "They're your parents, Daniel. Not mine." There it was. The sentence that ended my marriage. Not legally. That came later. But in my mind, my marriage ended right there. They're not mine. This woman had eaten Thanksgiving dinner at their table. My mother had cooked her favorite peach pie every year because Melissa once mentioned she liked it. My father had repaired her car twice and refused to accept money. Whenever we visited, Dad walked us outside at night and stood in the driveway until our taillights disappeared. Mom had spent 4 months making our wedding quilt. They had called her their daughter, and when they stood at her door with nothing, she looked at them and thought, "Not mine." I didn't scream. I didn't break anything. I just looked at her. Then I turned around and left. I drove back to the parking lot. "Get your things," I told my parents. Dad looked at me. "Where are we going?" "Home." He knew what I meant. I loaded their bags into my rental car. Mom held Rachel's photograph. Then I drove them to my house. Melissa was still there. She stood in the hallway when we entered. Nobody said anything. I carried my parents' bags into the guest room. I changed the sheets. I found clean towels. I put Rachel's photograph on the nightstand. Then I went into the kitchen and made chicken soup. It was one of Mom's recipes. She taught me when I was 13 because, according to her, every man should know how to feed himself and somebody he loves. That night, my parents slept in beds. My wife slept in our bedroom. I slept on the couch. The next 10 days were some of the strangest of my life. Mom tried to make herself invisible. She woke before everyone else. She folded blankets. She wiped counters that were already clean. If she used a coffee cup, she washed it immediately. One morning, she said, "I'm sorry I used the bathroom before you." I had to walk outside. Imagine being 71 years old. Your home burns down. Your daughter-in-law refuses you shelter. Then when your son finally brings you inside, you apologize for using his bathroom. Dad handled it differently. He became quiet, quieter than usual. Every morning, he sat on the back porch with coffee. Sometimes I joined him. Most mornings, we said almost nothing. But I noticed something. Whenever Melissa walked into the room, Dad's jaw tightened. He never insulted her, never confronted her, never raised his voice. But he knew, and she knew he knew. Melissa, meanwhile, acted like she was the victim. If Mom used a towel, Melissa sighed. If Dad watched television, she complained that it was too loud. If Mom cooked, Melissa mentioned that she had planned to use the kitchen. She spent hours in our bedroom with the door closed. When she came out, she wore the expression of someone surviving an enormous personal tragedy. Meanwhile, my parents were trying to rebuild their entire lives. I started making phone calls. Insurance, rental properties, contractors, banks, friends, anybody who might help. Dad insisted he would pay me back for everything. I told him to stop saying it. He kept saying it. "That's Dad." One night, maybe a week after I came home, I woke around 2 in the morning. The kitchen light was on. Mom was sitting at the table. She was wearing an old robe I'd found for her. Rachel's photograph was in front of her. There was a cup of coffee beside it. Cold. I sat down across from her. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then Mom touched the edge of the new crack in the frame. She would have been 33. I know. Can you imagine Rachel at 33? I smiled. Terrifying. Mom looked up. Terrifying? Absolutely. She'd probably be running a hospital by now, while organizing protests on weekends. Mom laughed. A real laugh. The first one I'd heard since coming home. She always did like telling people what to do, especially when nobody asked. Especially then. We both smiled. Then Mom looked at the photograph again. Her smile slowly disappeared. She always said family was the only thing worth fighting for. I remembered that. Rachel had said versions of it 100 times. Family isn't always easy. Family can drive you crazy. Family can disappoint you. But when the world knocks somebody down, you don't stand there asking whether helping them is convenient. You reach down. That night, sitting across from my mother, I finally admitted something to myself. My marriage was finished. I wasn't angry enough to make that decision. I was clear enough. There's a difference. Anger passes. Clarity doesn't. 3 days later, I asked Melissa to sit with me at the kitchen table. My parents were out looking at rental houses with a friend of Dad's. I didn't want them there for the conversation. Melissa sat across from me. She looked tired. So she said, "Are we finally going to talk about this?" "Yeah, good." I folded my hands. I've spent the last few days trying to find a way past what happened. She rolled her eyes slightly. That almost made things easier. "I've tried to understand your side." "You should. I do understand it." She looked surprised. "I understand exactly what your side is. You value your comfort more than you value the people I love. That's unfair. Maybe, but it's what I believe now. She started talking. I raised my hand. Please, let me finish. She stopped. I'm not asking you to love my parents exactly the way I do. I'm not asking you to become their nurse. I'm not asking you to give up your life. Then what are you asking? Nothing anymore. She stared at me. I continued. When my parents came to this house, they had just watched everything they owned burn. They weren't asking for money. They weren't asking to live here forever. They needed one safe night. They would have stayed longer. Maybe. Exactly. And if they did, we would have dealt with it. You weren't here. No, I wasn't. And that's the part one can't get past. Her face changed. While I was gone, I trusted you with my home. I thought that meant the people I loved would be safe here if something happened. I'm your wife, Daniel. I'm not your employee. I know. Then stop acting like I failed some test. I looked at her for a long moment. You did. She stood up. So that's it? You're choosing them? Yes. Over your wife? Yes. Over 5 years of marriage? I thought about it. No. I'm choosing what those 5 years were supposed to mean. She shook her head. You'll regret this. Maybe. You will. Maybe I will. I stood up. But I don't regret it today. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. For a moment, I almost felt myself soften. Then I remembered Mom apologizing for using the bathroom. I remembered Dad sleeping upright behind the steering wheel. I remembered Rachel's photograph on the dashboard. And I said the only thing left to say. You should have opened the door, Melissa. She said nothing. That's all you had to do. I filed for divorce 2 weeks later. It wasn't dramatic. There were no screaming matches. No revenge. No destroyed property. I didn't want revenge. I wanted distance. I found my parents a small rental house on the south side of Amarillo. 1 story, 2 bedrooms, a covered front porch, a decent kitchen, a backyard big enough for Mom to plant vegetables. I paid the deposit and the first several months of rent. Dad argued with me for 20 minutes. I ignored him. Sometimes loving your family costs money. Sometimes it costs time. Sometimes it costs comfort. Sometimes it costs you a marriage. You pay what it costs. Mom planted marigolds by the porch during the first week. Then tomatoes. Then peppers. Within a month, she had turned that backyard into something alive. It amazed me how quickly she did it. A few weeks earlier, she'd been standing barefoot outside a burning house, watching almost 4 decades of memories disappear in front of her. Now she was kneeling in the dirt with gardening gloves on, complaining that the soil needed more compost. That was Mom. Life could knock her flat, and somehow she'd still find something to plant. Dad found his own way of settling in. He met a neighbor named Earl who lived 2 houses down. Earl had an old pickup truck with transmission trouble. The next Saturday, I pulled into my parents' driveway and saw 2 legs sticking out from underneath the truck. I knew those boots. Dad, his head appeared from beneath the truck. What's up? What are you doing? What does it look like I'm doing? Are you getting paid for this? Dad slid himself out from under the truck and stared at me like I'd just asked the dumbest question he'd heard all year. He's my neighbor. Apparently, that answered the question. Some people simply are who they are. You can take away their house. You can take away almost everything they own. But you can't take away the part of them that makes them who they are. Dad fixed things. Mom took care of people. And somehow, little by little, they started building a life again. About 6 weeks after they moved in, Dad and I hung Rachel's photograph above the fireplace. We bought a new frame. Simple oak. Nothing expensive. Mom kept the burned frame. She put it in a drawer in her bedroom. I saw her do it. I didn't ask why. I knew. Some damaged things are still too important to throw away. Dad held the photograph while I measured the wall. Little higher, he said. I moved the nail. That good. Maybe half an inch left. Dad, what? It's a photograph, not an engine block. I want it straight. I laughed. Of course you do. Eventually, we got it exactly where he wanted it. Dad stepped back after we hung the photograph. He put his hands in his pockets. For a long moment, he just looked at Rachel. There she is, he said quietly. I looked up. There she is. Sunlight came through the front window and touched the glass. For just a second, Rachel's face seemed brighter. Almost alive. I know that sounds sentimental. I don't care. That's how it felt. Like she'd finally found the right wall. The divorce was finalized several months later. On the day everything became official, I walked out of the courthouse and sat in my truck for almost half an hour. I didn't start the engine. I just sat there. Was I sad? Of course. I had loved Melissa. Or maybe I'd loved the person I believed she was. There were good years, good memories, trips, birthdays, quiet Sunday mornings, inside jokes that now belong to nobody. A marriage doesn't become meaningless just because it ends. I grieved it. I still do sometimes. There were nights when I'd lie awake and wonder if I'd acted too quickly. Maybe I should have tried counseling. Maybe I should have waited longer. Maybe I should have given Melissa another chance to explain herself. Those thoughts came, but they never stayed long. Because whenever I wondered if I'd been too harsh, I pictured that Buick. My father behind the wheel. My mother asleep against the passenger window. Rachel's photograph on the dashboard. 11 nights. 11 nights while there was an empty bed in my house. And the doubt disappeared. After the divorce, I started visiting my parents most evenings. Mom always had food. Too much food. She'd spent her whole life feeding people, and apparently retirement wasn't going to stop her. I'd walk through the door, and she'd immediately ask if I was hungry. It didn't matter what I said. No, Mom. I already ate. You can still have something. I'm not hungry. I made meatloaf. Mom. And mashed potatoes. 10 minutes later, I'd be sitting at the table with a full plate. Some battles aren't worth fighting. Dad and I usually sat on the porch afterward, coffee in hand, watching the Texas sky change. There's something about a sunset out there. The horizon is so wide that the sky seems bigger than it should be. Pink, orange, purple, then darkness. Life can be falling apart, and the sky doesn't care. It stays beautiful anyway. I used to find that irritating. Now I think I understand it. The world doesn't stop because you're hurting. But that also means your hurt doesn't stop the world from offering you something beautiful. About 3 months after my divorce was finalized, Dad and I were sitting outside on a Thursday evening. Mom was inside humming while she cooked. Dad and I hadn't said anything for maybe 10 minutes. We were comfortable that way. Always had been. When I was younger, I used to think Dad and I didn't have much to talk about. It took me years to realize that wasn't true. We simply didn't need words all the time. Then Dad smiled, just slightly. You know, he said, Rachel would have handled this whole situation very differently. I looked over at him. Oh, definitely. Much louder. I laughed. She would have arrived at that parking lot with a news crew. Dad nodded seriously. And signs. She would have had them professionally printed. Probably matching shirts, too. Absolutely. Dad started laughing. She would have made us wear them. She would have made everybody wear them. Even me, especially you. Dad shook his head. Your sister was something else. Yeah. She never knew when to leave something alone. Nope. Always had to get involved. Every single time. Dad smiled. And most of the time, she was right. Don't ever tell her that. There was a short silence. Then I realized what I'd said. Don't ever tell her. For one strange second, I'd forgotten. Dad looked at me. I looked at him. Then he smiled again. Wouldn't dream of it. And somehow that made it okay. We both laughed. For a minute, Rachel was there. Not physically. I know that. But that's the strange thing about people you lose. Sometimes they return through a joke, a phrase, a song, the way somebody tilts their head. For those few minutes, my father and I were sitting on a porch laughing with the memory of a woman we'd both give anything to see walk through the front gate. Then the laughter faded. Not sadly, just naturally. Mom's humming came through the screen door. Something smelled good from the kitchen. The evening air was warm. I leaned back in my chair. I was 42 years old. My marriage was over. My sister had been gone 7 years. My parents had lost the home where almost every important memory of my childhood happened. There are things in my life I will never get back. That's true. But sitting there, I realized something else. I knew who I was. And more importantly, I knew exactly why I'd made the choice I did. For a long time, I thought character was about the big decisions, the dramatic moments, the things people write books about, the moments when everyone is watching and you know whatever you do next will matter. I don't believe that anymore. I think character is usually revealed by something much smaller. Sometimes it's revealed by a door. Someone knocks. They need you. Opening that door will inconvenience you. Maybe a little, maybe a lot. And you have a choice. Open it or don't. Melissa had that choice. One night, one door, Two exhausted people standing outside. My parents had loved her without keeping score. My mother remembered her birthday every year. My father fixed her car. They welcomed her at every holiday. They treated her like family because their son loved her. They never asked what they were getting in return. That's not how my parents operated. If you were family, you were family. Simple as that. Then came the one night when they needed something in return. Not money, not a permanent home, not someone to rebuild their house for them. Just kindness, just a bed, just one night where they could close their eyes somewhere safe and wake up without wondering if somebody was going to knock on the window of their car and tell them to move. And she closed the door. Everything that happened afterward came from that moment. The parking lot, my homecoming, the arguments, the divorce, all of it. One closed door. I don't tell this story because I think everyone should choose their parents over their spouse in every disagreement. Life isn't that simple. Marriage matters. Your spouse should matter deeply. When you marry someone, you make promises. You build something together. And if you run away every time things get difficult, you won't have much of a marriage left. I understand that. But there are moments when disagreement becomes revelation. When an argument stops being about who is right and who is wrong. When someone shows you something about their values that you can't pretend you didn't see. That was my moment. I wasn't divorcing Melissa because she didn't like my parents. I wasn't divorcing her because she wanted privacy. I wasn't even divorcing her because she made a bad decision. People make bad decisions. I made plenty. I was leaving because after everything happened, she still couldn't understand why it was wrong. That was the part one couldn't get past. If she had opened the door when I came home and said, "Daniel, I made a terrible mistake," maybe things would have been different. If she had driven to that parking lot herself and apologized, maybe there would have been something left to save. If she had looked at my mother and father and shown even a little shame for what she'd done, I might have tried. I don't know. I'll never know. Because she didn't. She defended it. She justified it. She looked me in the eye and told me they weren't her parents. And she was right. Biologically, they weren't. But I always believed marriage was supposed to make that distinction less important. Apparently, she didn't. My parents are older now. Dad moves more slowly. He'll never admit it, but his knees hurt. Sometimes when he gets out of his chair, he puts one hand on the armrest and pauses for half a second before standing. He thinks I don't notice. I notice. Mom forgets little things sometimes. Nothing serious. She'll put her glasses down and spend 10 minutes looking for them while they're sitting on top of her head. Then Dad will point upward. She'll touch her head, and they'll both laugh. They won't always be here. I know that. Maybe that's why I spend more evenings on that porch than I used to. Maybe that's why I listen more carefully when Dad tells a story I've already heard 15 times. Maybe that's why I always take home whatever leftovers Mom pushes into my hands. There will come a day when I would give anything for one more container of food I didn't ask for. One more story about a carburetor. One more cup of coffee with Dad. One more time hearing Mom call from the kitchen to ask whether anybody wants dessert when she already knows she's going to serve it anyway. One more sunset on that porch. So I don't rush those evenings anymore. Sometimes I sit there until the stars come out. Sometimes Dad talks. Sometimes I talk. Sometimes nobody says anything. And that's enough. I used to think coming home meant returning to a house. Now I know better. A house can burn. A marriage can end. Possessions disappear. Photographs crack. Everything you thought was permanent can change before morning. Home isn't the building. It's the people who would open the door. That's what my parents taught me. That's what my sister believed. And in a strange way, that's what my ex-wife taught me too. She showed me the difference between someone living in your house and someone belonging to your family. Those aren't always the same thing. If I could go back to that day at the airport, knowing everything I know now, would I do anything differently? No. I'd still leave my bags in the rental car. I'd still drive straight to that parking lot. I'd still climb into the back seat. I'd still put my hand on my father's shoulder. I'd still hold my mother. I'd still bring them home. I'd still make the soup. I'd still file the papers. I'd still pay the rent. I'd still hang Rachel's photograph above the fireplace. I'd choose them again, every single time, because someday, the people who once held everything together for you may be the ones standing outside your door. They may be older. They may be scared. They may be trying not to show it. They may tell you they only need one night, because asking for more feels like too much. And when that moment comes, you won't have forever to decide what kind of person you are. Sometimes you only have the few seconds between hearing the knock and opening the door. So here's the question I want to leave you with. If you came home and discovered that your spouse had turned your elderly parents away after they lost everything, leaving them to sleep in a car for 11 nights, would you fight to save your marriage? Or would you make the same choice I did and walk away for good?